Hey everyone! In today's video, we'll be going over 11 tips for quickly renaming multiple layers in Figma, and you're welcome to work together with me in this file. I will leave the link to it in the description, otherwise you can just keep on watching. If you're in this file, there will be two pages. The first one is the playground, which is where we'll be working, and the second one is before afters, which will contain examples of what the layers were named like before and what should be the expected result. So let's get started with our first tip, which is going to be renaming multiple layers to have the same name. And what we're going to start with is by selecting all of the layers that we want to rename. And then we'll do the Command R to open up the renaming model. And as you can see here on the left, you'll have the preview of what the layer names currently are. In this case, it's rectangle 1, rectangle 2. And so usually when you create rectangles, groups, frames, almost anything in Figma, it automatically assigns a number afterwards. That's the default behavior. For our example here, let's say we want to rename this to have the same name, for example, square. So what I'm going to do is in this rename to text input, which will be focused by default when you open the model, I'll just put in square and press rename. And now, as you can see, all of my layers have the same name, square. Moving on to our second example, let's say we want to add an ascending order. In this example, I'm starting with all of my squares named square. What I'm going to do is select all of this. I want to keep the name as square. So what I can do, I can either press this current name button, and it's going to automatically fill in like the $ and ampersand, which stands for keeping the current name. And then I'm going to add an ascending order. So again, I can either use one of these buttons as a shortcut, or I can just type it manually. So it's going to be a $ and a little n for the ascending order. If I wanted to have more digits, I can just type in another n, and then you press rename. And now, as you can see, I start from 1 and go all the way up to 7. In this third example, we're going to modify it for the order to be descending. So what I'm going to do is select Command R to open the model. And honestly, in this case, I'm not really modifying an existing string. I'm overriding it completely. So I'm going to type in square, and I guess I had the 2 underscores as a separator. And now what I'm going to do, I'll do the $, and this time I'll do a capitalized N, and this will give me the descending order. So now my first square here is square 7, and my last one is square 1. In this fourth example, we'll be adding ascending order, but alphabetical. And this isn't something that you can do natively in Figma, so we'll be using a plugin for that. And as you can see, for all the sections where we do have to use a plugin, I have a little puzzle. So what we're going to do is we'll be using a rename it plugin. You begin by selecting all of your shapes, just like you would do when you are using the native Figma functionality. Then I'm going to go to plugins. We'll search for rename it, and it's going to be right here. And let's start by just choosing the rename selected layers. Currently, all of our layers are just called squares, and we want to keep the same name. Here, if we want to keep the current name, we're going to use the % and the star, and then we'll do % and either a lowercase a if you just want the letters to be lowercase, or you can do an uppercase a if you want the letters to be uppercase. Now, as you can see, our squares were updated to the alphabetical order, and the reason I'm starting with G and not with A is because of the ordering of my layers here. So if I had this layer at the top, it would have been the other way around. And there is no way to do like the reverse order right away. So you just need to make sure that your layers here are in the correct order that you want them to be in. The fifth example is changing syntax, and we're back using native Figma functionality, and this one is the hardest for me personally to remember. Here we're starting with the syntax where we have rectangle, then 2 underscores and 2 digits at the end. And what we want to do is that we want to swap this order. So we want to have our 2 digits first, then 2 underscores, then rectangle. So what I'm going to do is, again, select all of the layers, Command R to open the model, and we're going to start in this match text input. And the first thing that we want to do is that we want to select our part that just contains the rectangle. So these are just going to be letters. And in our letters here, we're going to have both lowercase and we're going to have uppercase. And then we want anything that follows, and that's going to select our rectangle part. Then we have our 2 underscores, so that's kind of the separator. And for our next part, we just want to have all the digits. So what I'm going to do is just select a number, or all the numbers rather. And then in our replace input, we're going to have our second piece, which is this part. Then we'll have our 2 underscores, and then we'll have our first piece. Then we do rename, and as you can see, it switched the syntax. Moving on to our next example, and here we'll be working with some icons. In this example, we want to add a prefix to our icons, for example, icon-compass instead of just compass. Once again, we'll begin by selecting all of our layers, Command R to rename, and then I'm going to add the prefix that I want. In this case, it's icon dash, and then we'll keep the current name and press rename, and now our names are updated. Now, let's say in this next example, I want to get rid of that prefix. What I'm going to do is select, and now I'm going to start with the match text input here. I'll do icon dash or whatever prefix you have, and that's it. I'll just click rename after that, and it will get rid of that prefix. What essentially it does, it checks for the icon dash match, and then it replaces it with nothing because we didn't put anything in our replace field. This next example, find and replace. Here we have a couple icons that have the word vehicle in them, and maybe we want that to say car instead. What we're going to do is select, and we'll match anything that says vehicle, and we'll replace it with car, and rename. And now it says car, no matter where the original word was in the string. In example 9, we'll go back to using the plugin, and in this example, we'll be using it to change from capitalized to lowercase. We'll select, and I'm going to use Command P to open the quick menu. I will type in rename it, and this time we'll be using the quick rename feature, so I'll press tab. What I'm going to do is %, star, lowercase, and %. So the star, just keeping the current name, then L for the lowercase, and now you can see in the preview. Press enter, and now our names are updated to lowercase. In example 10, we'll also be using the plugin. Again, I'll begin by selecting them, then Command P and tab to open the quick rename. Here, we don't want to change it to lowercase. What we'll do instead is that we'll keep the current name, and we're going to add, let's say, like width or the height. So sometimes it could be useful for icons. Maybe we can also separate them with a dash. And then enter, and enter to rename. And now our names are updated to current name, dash, and the width of the icon. This last example is pretty unique, but something that I find myself doing all the time. So when I make a component and I need to add a new set of variants, very often I don't go to the properties panel here, and instead I just select the variants and I use the renaming feature to add a new property. For example, here I currently have my button and I just have one property which is called type. I have solid, outline, and ghost. And let's say I wanted to add another property, for example, size. The way I would do it is I select all of my variants, I do the rename. From here, I'm going to keep the current name, obviously. Then I do the comma. And now I want to add the name of my new property, which is going to be size, but could be anything in your case. Then equals to assign the size value. In this case, all of this, let's say, are going to be medium. Rename. Now, if you look on the right, you'll see my new property and my new value. And after I do this, I typically start adding new variants and assigning the sizes or whatever it is that I'm doing. Okay, these were all the tips that I wanted to share. Of course, there are other ways to use the renaming feature in Figma and also way more different ways to use the renaming plugin. I'm just sharing the ones that I personally use all the time and find the most useful. I will leave the links both to Figma's documentation and the documentation for the plugin so you can check it out and see what other capabilities they have, and maybe you'll discover something else for yourself. With that said, I do hope that you learned something new here, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.